Hello and welcome to a tutorial on how to edit True Restoration podcasts with Ableton Live 10. I'm using the intro version here with a few plugins. So when you first launch the program, this is the window you get. I haven't been able to figure out any sense of this vertical track layout system. So the first thing I always do is switch to horizontal by clicking this button over there, or the tab key on the keyboard also switches between those two different modes. So important things to note are this is the main editing area. Each of the colored bars over here are your different tracks for your different audio files. Here over on this side there's a bunch of more like the audio effects, and then you can also browse through your audio files, source files over here. I usually just use my second monitor with Windows Explorer, but so I usually leave this in the audio effects or plugins. Those are really the only two that I use on a regular basis. So to start with, we're going to need an audio file, and so I'm going to bring in just some music. It's the Francis Watch intro actually, but I'll pull in some music here, and there you can see that's the sound waves from the music. I'm gonna switch to my USB speakers. You probably won't be able to hear it through this, but actually in order to change the output speaker in Ableton, you have to go to Preferences and set your audio output device here rather than through the regular Windows interface. So, and that didn't work. Yeah, so for some reason Ableton, at least for me, is giving me like two different options for all of my sound devices. Let's try the DX option. There we go. That worked. Okay, so now I can get my regular sound through my speakers. And you'll know what that sounds like if you've listened to Francis Watch. But in any case, so that's for audio, like a music file, we'll just bring it right in. For an actual podcast recording, the first step we always do is we run it through a software called the Levelator. It's by CN. There'll be a link for downloading it, but this is just a very simple little utility that unifies the volume and other things of your audio file. So I'm gonna take this, I'm gonna drag an audio file, and yeah, it only works with WAV files. Yeah, I forgot, which is kind of a nuisance. But so if your original recordings are in MP3s, you're gonna have to convert them to waves and then back to MP3s. But here's a WAV file. You just drop it there, and then it does its progress bar, and then it outputs it to the same directory with the name of output, I believe, or like it adds the dot output to the final file. But if you compare, like for example, an unlevelated one, see, like if you just look at the comparison of the peaks, see there's a very big difference there. You can see this is the levelated one, and you can see the peaks are much higher, which means that they have a higher initial volume, whereas on this one the peaks are very small, which means that the volume is not very loud. And you can increase the peak size by enlarging the track columns, but that just means that you're going to need to do more audio effects to get the same output volume. And so, for example, if you can mute each track by clicking on this track number option, and then it'll gray out, and that means it's muted. So I'm just going to mute this levelated track here, And then if I hit play, you can see the volume bars over here. And so that's about halfway volume. And again, on the master, you can see it's only halfway. One interesting thing that you guys would like to know is that any effect or whatever that you do in this master track will apply to all of the other tracks. So example, if you increase the volume, if you add an effect to increase the volume in the master track, it will increase the volume of all the tracks by the same amount. So you don't really put audio files in here on a regular basis, at least, but sometimes you might want to put a certain effect in there to apply to all the different tracks. So just some quick navigation inside Ableton. Control mouse wheel is zoom, and then shift mouse wheel is to pan side to side. That's a handy new feature in Ableton 10. In Ableton Live, in Ableton 9, it doesn't work quite the same. I don't think the shift scroll feature works. And spacebar is play and pause. I don't think, yeah, you can actually. Yeah, so some of the main editing tools here, yeah, so this one's done. And if I look at my output directory, yeah, it creates a new file with the addition added. It just adds .output to the existing file name and puts it in the same directory. But you want to run all your source files through that before you bring them into Ableton, just because it equalizes the volume of the even like if you have different speakers, it just equalizes everything out and just makes it sound a lot nicer. So now I'm just going to show you some quick editing tricks. Backspace will delete a sound clip. One other setting I always turn off is this fixed grid setting. If you right click, I just set it to off, because then that way my tracks aren't locked to a specific time keyframes, because like if I do the grid, then I have to put my audio files lined up with a grid. And so if you're doing music and stuff, yeah, sure, that's fine. But if you're for podcasts and stuff, it doesn't work. So I'm just going to mute the music for now. And this is just some initial talk from Steven and Father Troner before the show starts. And now, okay, that's where the show actually starts. So now I'm going to right click. There we go. Because I'm not used to right clicking on it. Because I just always use the keyboard shortcut. And so that's for split. And that will break our audio clip into 2 different audio clips. And so now we can just delete that one. Either the delete key or backspace works just fine. And then if you want to just add a quick fade, if you hover over the edge, you'll get these bars, these little squares on the top and the bottom. Dragging the bottom one doesn't do anything. But if you drag the top one, you can see how it's compressing the waveform. That's adding a fade. And then you can also adjust the steepness of the fade by using this little intermediate. And then you can reset the fade also if you need to by right clicking. And then another handy thing about Ableton is that if you do clip a file but then you realize that you clipped it too early or something, if you hover over this top title bar part at the very edge, you'll get this little bracket shaped cursor. And then if you click and drag that will extend the audio back to where it came from. And then you can also go both ways. So that's a very handy feature for getting back stuff rather than undoing it. If you do put a split in the wrong place, then you can just drag it back out that way. So typically for a podcast, we start the speaker begins at around 15 seconds. 15 minutes would be a lot. So we have about 15 seconds of music. and then the speaker comes on. So in order for the speaker to come on, we need to adjust the music volume so that it doesn't drown the Steven out in this case. So to do that, we need to use an automation, which by default in Ableton 10 are hidden. And so in order to be able to use them, you have to go over here to this little two dots on a line button, and you have to click that. And that will enable your little drop down boxes here. And so for some there we go. And so right now it's set to only show automated parameters or something. We want to hit show all parameters for starters at least. And so since this is a new project, there's nothing in there yet, but here if you add more effects you'll get other things, but right now if you don't have any effects added, the only option you'll have is the mixer, and that's for your sound output, so your speakers in this case. So once you select the effect that you want to automate up here, then you'll have subcategories of different options. So you can automate the speaker being on, or in this case we want the track volume. And so this dotted red line means that this effect has not been automated yet. If we click somewhere on it, that'll add a little red dot, and then the whole line will turn solid to indicate that it's been automated. If you can click the dot again, and it'll disappear. So in order to do a quick automation on the music here, the 0 dB means that it's not amplified or diminished or anything. So we're going to add 2 different points and a third one here. And so I'm going to adjust the track volumes and stuff, you can either click and drag on the individual points, or if you hover, you can once a line between 2 points turns blue, then you can just drag that whole line, and that will just cause the line to go rather than the individual point. Or you can drag it just a point and adjust it that way. So we're gonna cause a sharp drop in the volume when the Steven first comes on. And then we're going to keep the audio at a fairly decent volume, slowly tapering off for a little bit, and then we're going to bring it down all the way. So I'm going to unmute this. Yeah, so if you probably can't hear that, but the music is gradually fading away, and like I'll tweak this stuff gradually to get it to sound right, but that's not quite the purpose. This tutorial is mainly just to show you how to do stuff, not exactly how to do it exactly correct. So that's the automation, and then if you click to delete points, then it'll all go back to original. I've noticed that with a lot of the effects, if you set a certain effect, then when you're playing it, it'll automatically jump to that effect over here, and it won't let you see your automated effect anymore. So I'll show you that later though in action. So for editing the show, you basically just listen to it, split any place you want to cut out, you just split it, and then either a handy thing about Ableton is crossfades. So like whenever you do make a break, if you drag something over top of another audio clip, then and you hover over it, you have to disable, in order to use the fades for the audio clips, you have to disable automations. So that's either this little button over here again, or the A key on your keyboard that will enable or disable automation. So in order to use fades, you have to disable automation. So with automation disabled, then we can now fade. And so what this is called a crossfade, and it will it will fade out the previous track while at the same time fading in the new track. So you get kind of a nice blend to the sound that way. It helps just smooth things out a little bit. And so you'll just go through removing vocal clutter and other accidents. But then the main magic that happens in Ableton is with the audio effects that we have. So some of the primary ones that we use are in the built-in, like Ableton comes with these automatically. The ones we use most often are the limiter and the gate here. The limiter is used, I don't know why it's called the limiter, but it's an amplifier. And so first you have to select the track that you're interested in, and then you double click the limiter, and then it'll show up down here in the audio effects bar. If for some reason your bar down here looks like this, which is like a clip view, I think, then the only way I know how to get out of that is by pressing Shift Tab on your keyboard. That toggles between those two different modes for this bottom area down here. So just like Tab is used to change between vertical and horizontal layout of this window, Shift Tab changes this bottom window. But in any case, if you watch our sound volume bars over here, our volume's quite loud. It's this horizontal bar here is like the limit of normal, like max volume. So you want your audio to be close to that, but you don't really want it to go over. But if we adjust the gain on our limiter over here, then you can watch the audio will be really clinging to that bar a lot. And down here you can see this orange part is all coming down, and that means that it's going above its natural limit. So you don't want this bar to show orange, because that means it's going above this. Your audio is going above max volume, which will just make it sound worse if you turn the volume up really loud on like your car stereo system or your good speakers or something. So pretty much the only thing I ever adjust in the limiter is gain. Apparently you can adjust ceiling and stuff, look ahead. I really don't know what those do, so I don't bother with them. I just adjust the gain. So that's a pretty simple plugin to use, and it works pretty good for the amplifying, for example, the unequalized audio that if you didn't run it through that Levelator program, then you definitely need to use a limiter to boost your audio volume up a bit closer to that top bar so that it can actually sound good on a bunch of different speakers and stuff. So then the other default plugin that we use is the gate. And this one's a little bit more complicated, but the idea behind it is that it's a noise gate, and that it cuts off any noise that's below a certain volume. So right now I can just barely hear every couple syllables from Steven talking because I've set to way too high. So the white outline sound is what actually is heard. The gray stuff is everything that's not being is being cut off, shut out. So for a regular show, we need to drop the threshold way down, and then we need to set the return up because we don't want it to really, what we're trying to cut out here is the background noise. So that's just kind of static from the recording and whatever. So we want to just play around with this until we can get rid of background noise, but not cut out anything that Steven's actually saying. So there you can see, like when he pauses, instead of getting background noise, we're just getting silence because the gate is cutting it all out. And so you can play with these parameters to get it to sound just like you want. But then I've also noticed that if you're using this gate, it'll oftentimes, like if the host will say like an S, like a smart, or any word that starts with an S, the gate will often cut out like that first initial part of the S sound. So if that's the case, you can use an automation to lower the threshold and to let that S get through and then bring it back up again. So for example, if we go back into enable our automations again by clicking this button here or pressing the A key, you can now here in this we have limiter, gate, and mixer instead of just mixer. Up here we still have mixer because we haven't added any effects to this top track. We've only added effects to this track here with our podcast. So now we have the limiter and the gate and the automatable parameters here. See, we can automate the gain of the limiter as well, just like we did the track volume up here. But for the gate, we're interested in automating the threshold, and so it'll show low down here. And if the gate is cutting off a sound that we want, we're going to want to bring the gate lower, and it doesn't really matter how low you bring it. You'll just want to bring it low because that will allow more sound to go through. So if you saw there over down here, the bar is actually moved as you're playing it through to reflect how the threshold is changing. So that will allow through some quieter sound. And if, for example, you don't want to clip out a cough or something, or just some noise because it'll bring the phrases and stuff too close together, like there's no empty space, then you can increase the gate threshold to block that noise out. So for example, I'm just going to block out some text here, just some audio rather. And so just to show how it's done, so that's a little too low. I'm going to need to bring it up even higher. So that should definitely kill it. So if you watch this window down here, now I'm not hearing anything until the threshold comes back down again. So that's how you can use the gate to get rid of unwanted noise, either like background noise or extra loud mistakes like bangings and stuff that might happen. You can use the gate to get rid of all of that stuff. And then if you get your settings right, then it'll basically just eliminate all background noise, which is very nice because you'll pretty much always get background noise. But then, those are the two, and so for the gate, you just adjust the threshold and the return till you see the stuff you don't want getting blocked out. You can play around with these other parameters, but I don't know how to use them myself, so you'll have to look for some other tutorials on how to use those. So then the other effects that we use are all plugins. And so for these, the main ones I use are this RX6 voice denoise. That kind of does the same thing as the gate, but it works a little better on when there's actually noise in the actual as the person is speaking. So the gate will only take out audio that falls whose volume is too low, whereas then this effect will actually clean out noise while the person's actually speaking. So you can just adjust the threshold and reduction until it sounds right. To often I end up bringing the threshold and reduction just all the way up, and then using the limiter to compensate for the volume adjustment, and it seems to work. I think it works fairly well, but it's kind of personal preference and what sounds better and what doesn't. So, and again, for this, yeah, so here, now that we have this voice denoise, while I have, oh, now it's not doing it. But oftentimes, if I have the voice denoise plugin or any of these other RX or even the Ozone plugins, then if I'm playing the audio, this automation will automatically switch to showing this automation rather than one that I've actually edited, so like the gate threshold, for example. And so the only way I've found to keep it showing the parameter, the threshold I want as the automation that I want as I play, is by clicking this option down here, which is show automated parameters only. And then that will only show what I've made changes to, and so then that will hide the extra effect automations that I'm not interested in. But that's like just change, like if I just try to change it, then it would automatically jump back to this one, even if I don't want it. So I'll just, it's not doing it right now, but maybe if I add another one, it'll do it. So now, if you want to just quickly disable an effect to see what the difference in sound it makes, just click on this yellow button down here on the effect itself. That will disable it temporarily, and then you can just hit it there to enable it again. Another effect, a plugin that we use is the Ozone 8 Elements. This has a couple different plugins, a couple different effects kind of all packaged up into one. And so one of the big things is the equalizer. And so what this does is this is the frequencies of the audio signal. And so these, looks like, yeah, so here on the top we have the hertz, the frequency in hertz. And so these are low frequencies, like your low, really low sounds. And then these are higher sounds. So a lot of this, like a lot of when any recording, the really low stuff and the really high stuff you're not interested in because it's mainly just noise. So there are presets that you can save, and I've made one here, haha. But the main things you want to do is add a low pass filter, add a high pass filter, and a low pass filter. So right now I have like this number one, this point was selected, so I can drag it side to side to set where I want the filter to be. And so this is a high pass filter, but it blocks low frequencies. So that doesn't make sense to a lot of people, so I just try to explain it is that it's called a high pass filter because it lets higher frequencies pass. And so you put it on the low end, low frequencies, to let every frequency above it go through. And so then here on the high end, it's a low pass filter because it lets lower frequencies pass. So you just put one of those on each end and then kind of just adjust it so that it doesn't make the speaker sound muffled or anything. And then if there's also, you can also adjust intermediate points and add more. Just enable them by clicking these buttons, the little button there. And then that will enable you to, like if, I honestly don't even use these on a regular basis. But then like if one particular frequency range is a little too loud or something, then you can use this to quiet to bring the volume of those particular frequencies down without adjusting the volume of the rest of them. And then you can adjust the width of your equalizer point by dragging on the sidebars here. Double clicking it will set it back to default, and you can set the type of point that it is down here. And this is, you can also manually type in frequencies and your gain and stuff like that. So that's kind of the basics of the equalizer. You can save presets. I think somewhere one of these options, somehow, I haven't done it in a while, but I think somehow you can add a new preset, and so somehow, so now what the changes you've made will be set as this new one, and then you can save it or remove it. So I'm just going to get rid of it because I don't want to save it as another one. So that's the basics of using the EQ, the equalizer, that's what the EQ is short for. And then the other one useful tool in here is the imager. And so this is really helpful for determining whether a source file is mono or stereo. And so a stereo file is actually two separate audio streams, and they're played through each speaker. So like your left and right speaker, you usually have two, because it's actually a slightly different audio track going through each speaker. It's not just the same audio, it's actually slightly different. And then the combination of those two audio streams produces a more realistic sound experience. But for a podcast, we don't really want a lot of stereo because it's just one person talking, and so all the sound should be coming from the same place. There isn't really any difference too much. So as you can see, the imager it's mainly all contained in one direction anyway. I can show you. Let me add this effect to the music track as well, because then you'll really be able to see a difference there. So here, for the music, you can see that the imager is just all over the place. And that's because music is much more stereo just by nature than a single person talking. So the imager on that is all over the place. And so if you do reduce the width of the music, it'll sound really tinny. Like, it won't sound nearly as full. And like if you increase it, then it sounds a little weird. So like for music, you typically just don't even touch this. But then if we go back to our podcast, there's a bit of so it looks like Steven's talking right now, and so his voice is doing a lot more stereo than Fathertronics was. So I'm gonna decrease the width of this stereo. I'm gonna decrease the width of the sound image, and that will make it sound like there's only one person talking and he's like right in front of me, whereas it's like before it's like he's like you can't really tell where the person is. I don't like bringing the width all the way down to 0, because for like a 2-person interview like this, because of the way usually we record in stereo mics, so there is a slight difference between the left and the right channels between the host and the guest. I prefer to leave a little bit of that width in there because then when it changes from the guest to the host and vice versa, then you can, like, the sound changes a little bit, and I like that. Some people might not, and so you just, depending on what you want, you just bring it all the way, and then that sounds like both the host and the guest are coming from the exact same place. Um, I prefer to leave it a little bit wider, just to make that little audible difference. In addition to just, you could tell it's a different person talking, but I like to get the little feeling that, oh, there's there. If you are listening to it on a stereo system, then it'll sound a little bit different when the guest comes on. So I like that. Other people might not. So it's kind of personal preference. I haven't really figured out what to do. Yeah, so now Father Troner's talking, and he's a lot narrower to begin with. And then, but then, if we go back, so yeah, Steven's really just a little bit just wider. Father Troner's, they're coming from both about the same direction anyway. So like for this one, it really wouldn't make much difference whether it was all the way closed or a little bit open. But like for some of them, you can really kind of reverse engineer the recording setup by looking at the image, the sound map image, because depending on how close together the host and the guest are sitting, and just the way the mic's oriented, then it'll pick up the either person better in one or the other mics. So you can do a little detective work actually just by looking at this sound map here of the stereo sound image. So that's just a little bit on how to use this imager. I don't know how to use this maximizer, so if you can, kudos to you. But that's the equalizer and imager. There's another, in this Neutron Elements plugin, there's another EQ. It's not really a good idea to use two EQs at the same time. It does weird things, so I just, if I do use the Neutron Elements, I disable this one, and then this is the compressor. I honestly haven't really noticed any kind of advantage to to using this as opposed to not using it. But basic idea is to set the threshold. You can tell it's doing something there, and then you kind of adjust the attack to and release to just make it more gradual or sound better somehow. I haven't really been able to notice much significant improvement with it, so I usually don't use it. But that's one of the tools that you can use. You can just right click on an effect and delete it. Spacebar again is pausing the audio. There's a couple other, like these RX dehum, declip, and declick. I've done a little experimenting with them, but I can't really get them to work too well. So the other plugin that we use is the de-esser, and that's by Waveshell. There's a couple other plugins that I've found that just to try and do different stuff, but they don't, like, for the podcast, like most of them are for like doing music and sound and like composing music and stuff. So a lot of it isn't really useful for podcasts. But the de-esser, it gets rid of the slithery S sounds that often come out in recordings. And so depending on what kind of sound map you see in this imager, to edit, like when you first add an effect, it'll bring up the configuration window for it. But then if you need to get back to it, you just press this gear button, the wrench icon on the effect here. And then this is a window, and you can drag it all around your screen, move it to a different monitor if you have one or whatever. And then you can even, if you leave it open, you switch to a different track, it'll disappear. If you switch your cursor back to that track, it'll come right up. You can move your cursor out while you can move your cursor in the track while the window's still open. You can play and pause everything while the window's still open, and you can just close it whenever you're done with it. So it's very handy to use there. But then, as I was saying, depending on what kind of audio image you're looking at here in this window, in this imager tool, then that will determine which de-esser you use. So there's a de-esser for mono and a de-esser for stereo. So typically for these podcasts, because I usually use the mono de-esser, but if you're leaving the stereo width a little wider, then you should use the stereo one. But this one works it's kind of the same way. You just double click on it. What's going on? Okay. Looks like I'll have to look into that. But anyway, that'll add another effect down here with a configuration window. And I think there's another tutorial on how to use that plugin. So I won't spend a lot of time on that. But then once you've done all your editing, you've done all your effects, oftentimes a lot of, like, if you're doing a lot of editing, you'll quite often end up with lots and lots and lots of different little splits. And something you might end up, if you listening to it again, I decided to remove this little clip here at the beginning. Well, now I have a whole bunch of different sound clips, and if I just try to drag one of them, then it just leaves the space between the next one, and that will get rid of any fades or anything else that I added to that. So the way you can move them all at once is you click in the header, and then you hold down Shift, and then you click on the last one you want. And then that way you can move them all together to bring them to close up a little gap. And then if you want to span multiple different clips that you have here, you want to place your cursor in the top track here that you want to move, and then holding down Shift, you just click on the bottom track, and that will select everything in those tracks, as you can see there, and then you can move them around. If your selection happens to be on the boundary of a clip, it will actually add a split there and then drag your audio. So like, I wasn't quite at this boundary, so it actually just split it, and then gave me a new file. And so you can do that again to show how that works. So like, I'll put my cursor here, click over there, and now drag, and poof, it broke that track there where I selected it. So and then you can also just click and drag to highlight stuff too. That works. Control A does work as well, but as you can see, that selects everything. Again, muting tracks is just over here on the button. You can also use solo. I think this S button is So what this S button does is that does a solo. That leaves the current track live, but it mutes every other track. So rather than individually clicking off the ones you don't want. If there is only one that you want to listen to at the time being, you can just click the S button, and then that will mute all the other tracks. And so it's just one click instead of a whole bunch. I really haven't used any of. I don't like use any of these tool op settings here or like any of these. If you do want to record onto an audio track in Ableton, you first have to select this record button here on the track. And then once that's red, then you can click the record button up here at the top of the screen. And now it will record whatever through your whatever microphone you have set here and as your audio input device. So that will record, and then you can just stop it. You can record as you're playing if you want to, as you're playing other audio, you can record, and you just stop it. I think spacebar works to stop it too. So that's how you can record into Ableton. And let's see what else. Any like outro music is the same principle. You just put your fades in from the other direction, going out. Usually use like a crossfade on every. If you're using the noise gate, it's not really as big of a deal, but you do still want to make sure that there's no really abrupt like silence, like where we're talking and then it just goes really quiet all of a sudden. So you just want to try and avoid that with fading stuff out in and out as much as possible, just to make it sound natural. Yeah, and there's 1.5 million other plugins and effects and stuff that you can play around with. Basically just make the show sound as good as you can. And then again, just remember, if you want to apply a certain effect to, like, say this audio track and the music, then you would put it down into you would click down into this master channel, which is default like really small down here, and you just click down here and add your audio effects to this track, and then that will apply it to the final, because this master track is the combination of all the different tracks. So like it's what you hear out of your speakers or your headphones when you have all of your tracks enabled and producing sound. So it's the final mix, that what you actually hear coming out. So if you add any effects to that master track, it will affect everything that you hear. So typically I don't use it because I apply all my effects individually to the different tracks, and it's for the most part it's usually just one track that has the host and the guest. If the host and the guest are in different tracks, for example, then there might be more of a need for the master. But if there's only one track, then yeah, what's the point? Because usually you don't apply the music doesn't get the same effects that the voice does, the talking does, because it's just different frequency ranges and all that good stuff. But in any case, getting tired here. Anyway, once you're done editing, then the most important thing is to export your final audio. And it's highly recommended that you save your project save your live set, because each project is called a set rather than like a project or whatever. So you just want to save your project file often as you're working, in case something happens and it goes haywire, your computer crashes or whatever. But then once you're done, you want to go down here to export audio and click on that. That'll bring up this window here. And then here you can select the rendered track. And so for most things, you're going to want the master track, and because that will produce as an audio file what you've been hearing all along as you've been editing your show. If you do mute, so like if you do mute a track in your, like before you bring up this window, that will not. If you mute a track, that will not be be rendered, and that will not. You won't be able to hear that in your rendered master, just like you won't hear it as you're playing it inside Ableton. But you can also render. There's different options. You could render just the track with Father and Stephen talking. You could render just the audio, the music track. Um, so you can just render a selection. So that's sometimes convenient for different things I do. If like I'm trying to like split up a recording of like a mass or a ceremony or something into like certain like motets or songs, then I'll just clip each end, and then I'll just select it like that, and then I'll go to export audio, and if I do selected tracks only, then it will export my final audio file will be just the audio between these two. Well, it'll start here and it'll last for that many, whatever those units are. So that's how you can. That's just one way to play around with the system. Typically, though, you'll just want to render it on the master, starting at. Want to make sure it starts at 111. And then if you are rendering it on the master track, the length will be. It will automatically cut off at the farthest out audio segment that you have. So like right now it would stop right at the end of this clip here. If you did have a clip that was farther out over towards the right here, like behind this section, it would render all the way out to that point. So that's just something to bear in mind. For these options, these are just extra options. Don't really need to play around with those. This is now down here is the file type. There's Ableton only exports two file types right now, either PCM WAV or MP3. It can also like do them both at the same time, like it'll produce one of each if you turn both of them on. Typically, we only produce the MP3 because that's the format that we use for the final product. So there's typically no other production, no other work that gets done to the file after this step. So we just do it as an MP3. If you're going to be sending the audio to someone else for further work, then it's recommended to do a WAV format because that's just a slightly better quality, and that will survive multiple editing procedures better, multiple renderings. So if there's more work to be done on the audio, my recommendation is for the WAV format. You can choose any of those formats, but if you're done, this is the final product, then you just export it as an MP3. It's a slightly smaller file size and it's more widely accepted. Yeah, just don't use. It looks like you can only upload to SoundCloud if it's off, but yeah, just don't bother with that or the video or any of that. Just select the MP3 and then you'll just hit export, and then you can browse where you're going to save it to, what you're going to call it. I'm just going to cancel it out. Well, and never mind, I'll show you the rendering process, at least how it starts. I'm going to put it in season 8. I'm going to actually put it in training. Okay, so I'm just going to call it untitled, and then once you hit OK, then it'll bring up this export audio dialog, and then it'll render very, very slowly. I'm not sure why it always renders so slowly. I have a pretty good computer, but it never uses like here up here you can actually show how much of the CPU Ableton's using, and as you can see it's only using 1% of it right now, which is kind of ridiculous. I wish it would use up more so it would render its stuff faster, but apparently that's not an option. So you just have to sit and wait while it renders, but I'm not going to sit through and wait. So then once it's all done, the dialogues will just disappear and you'll be left with this window. Um, the asterisk up here indicates whether or not the project file that you're working in has been saved or not. So that's just what that means. And so I think that's going to be all for this tutorial. Pretty think I've covered the basics of how to use Ableton and the effects and how to edit stuff. And yeah, if I think of more stuff that I missed, I'll have to make another video. But for now, that's gonna be all. Thanks for watching.